Hello, everybody. My name is Lindsay Martinez, and I am the host of your Conservation Relevancy Community site. And today I'm here to learn more about the Relevancy Roadmap and and how political and legal constraints can be a barrier to gaining broader public relevancy. I'm here with Mark Humpert, who is going to tell us more about that. And can you introduce yourself a bit?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay. I'm Mark Humpert, and I'm the Conservation Initiatives Director at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies in Washington, D.C.
Excellent. And what is your role with the Relevancy Roadmap?
So I was involved from the beginning, working with our coordinating team in putting together the process and the teams that developed the roadmap. So this has been an interest or a passion of mine for a long time to try to help us reach broader constituencies that I think will help further conservation. So I continue to work on implementation of the roadmap with our coordinating team as well.
Excellent. And you have been a captain of political and legal constraints for the roadmap, correct?
Yes. So I helped organize a team of thought leaders on some of the barriers that political and legal constraints provide for access to fish and wildlife agencies and broader engagement on fish and wildlife conservation.
Excellent. And political and legal constraints are one of five areas that the roadmap addresses, right?
Yes, when we identified the barriers through a group process, the barriers, I think we had around 30 barriers or so, kind of fell into five distinct categories. Two of them related to culture, both within agencies and our partners, and two were related to capacity. And there was a fifth group of barriers that fit more neatly into some of the political and legal constraints that we have in helping to advance relevancy. So we put all of those barriers into that category.
Awesome. So can you tell us, why did you need to make a section on political and legal constraints in the roadmap? Why is it there?
So fish and wildlife management in this country, as I think most people know, are managed by governmental agencies at the state and federal level. And so, of course, they're political in nature. And so there's certain benefits of that, certainly in helping to manage fish and wildlife in the public trust, but there can also be some barriers. The history of state fish and wildlife agencies is rooted in conservation of game species and a remarkable history and success in bringing back game species. And over time, those the governing bodies of state fish and wildlife agencies, whether they be cabinet level agencies or in many cases governed by commissions made up of citizens, they do tend to focus more on interests of certain interest groups like hunters and anglers. And so, one of the barriers, that we've seen is that there's a lot of interest groups out there that care deeply about fish and wildlife and want to advance fish and wildlife conservation, don't really understand how to access those political appointees that help govern fish and wildlife agencies, or may not have a comfort level. So we wanted to look at some ways that we can maybe overcome some of those barriers so that the governance of fish and wildlife agencies can be more accessible to broader constituencies.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And then next, can you tell us, how would someone who's working in an agency use the strategies under that political and legal constraint section to increase relevancy, to engage with a broader constituency?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we kind of broke down the political and legal constraints into five main barriers. Agency decision-making processes are used and influenced by a limited number of constituencies, was the first barrier. A lack of higher level executive support for agency engagement with broader constituencies was the second barrier. Agency governing bodies may not represent the nature-based values and outdoor interests of broader constituencies. Number four, lack of legislative support to engage and serve broader constituencies. And the fifth one, policies, practices, legal authorities, and funding restrictions limit an agency's ability to serve broader constituencies. So within each of those 5 barriers, our team developed a theory of change. So if we wanted, for example, to make those decision-making processes more transparent or involve broader constituencies, what are the steps that need to be taken, or what changes need to happen in order to kind of reach an outcome of where there might be a broader interest in or broader involvement by constituencies, that might include birders or hikers, just maybe folks that like to manage wildlife in their backyard. So we've developed these series of steps in order to accomplish that. So, we're not saying that the steps in the roadmap are necessarily all of the right steps. We do let them be guided by a theory of change. So we can hopefully meet an intended outcome at some point in time. But the roadmap is really intended to be a starting point. If this is a barrier that you would like to work on, or if you have partners that have an interest in it, the roadmap is kind of a launching pad to start thinking about how you can overcome that process. And I will say, we have a lot of dedicated public servants and commissioners that really work hard on a day-to-day basis to manage our fish and wildlife resources in the country. So this isn't about being disparaging to any of those individuals that are working hard on that. This is more about how can the work of fish and wildlife conservation is a huge undertaking, and some would argue that we're just not keeping pace of the many threats that fish and wildlife face. But what can we do to kind of make the tent a little bit bigger so that there's more people around the country that are engaged in a way that will help our public agencies be successful in their mission of conserving fish and wildlife?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for explaining that. For all the folks watching this, I'd encourage you to check out the Relevancy Roadmap in that political and legal constraints section. You can find the roadmap at relevancyroadmap.squarespace.com. And please use this community to ask your questions about political and legal constraints, and let us know what you're working on in this area. So thank you so much again to Mark today.
Okay. Thank you, Lindsay.